And
Hello and welcome to Joe and Cat Chats. Oh my goodness. Today we're talking about race, the media, and white fragility. I think it's a really timely episode. We're recording on March 23rd, 2021 on Facebook and YouTube at /JoeNiceDJ. You can always find us on socials at Joe and Cat Chats or on our personal pages at at Joe Nice DJ and at Catwells22. We're happy to be a part of Tastemakers Radio as well, which is on Dash Radio. So listen to us there every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. And as always, I'm excited to get into this topic. But first, how are you?
oh boy, that's a loaded question, Miss Wells.
I think it is today, yeah.
A lot going on. There's a lot on my mind, as you can clearly and plainly see. I'm wearing a mask again. The COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic is running wildly out of control in many countries, including mine and yours. It is important that we make sure that we adhere to whatever public health principles and guidelines we have been told to adhere to.
Yeah.
Wash your hands, remain physically distant, even though I know that stinks for a lot of people, and continue to mask up as much as reasonably possible. There is a palpable anger and rage and frustration that, quite honestly, I've been feeling for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's manifested itself into the events that we've seen over the past 7 days, the hypocrisy, the flagrant duplicitousness of the United States, and it's affecting a lot of people, and we're going to talk about it today because I really feel that, last week we talked about doing an episode about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We said, it might be a useful episode to do, but we decided to change things up on the fly because I truly believe that a lot of people around the United States and across your great country of Canada and around the world truly forgot everything that happened over this past summer. They forgot the lessons that should have been learned. They forgot what we have been talking about for 40 previous episodes. They forgot all of the books that everybody was supposed to be reading when loads of white people that I haven't spoken to in years called me up asking for help, asking for resources, asking for guidance and advice on how to deal with their racial issues.
Joe, I think I want to correct you.
So
here.
we're gonna. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I don't know if it's about forgetfulness. I think we need to have more of a conversation about how systemic this is and how just, I guess, directed this is. The ability of whiteness and white people to be complacent and to seemingly forget all of the lessons that we've been learning for the last year. So I just wanted to make that distinction because I know that that's what you mean, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
And I want to make sure that everybody understands that with this episode and all the other episodes, each conversation it's centered on collaboration and it's not centered on competition. And we want to make sure that every episode that we do focuses on fighting for these 4 fights, as you can plainly and clearly see on my shirt: humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. This is not a superfluous advertisement for the forthcoming merchandise. It's not about that now. It's about making sure that we center on what's most important. And that's what we're going to do over the next however long we have to do this. 55 minutes. How are you, Miss Wells?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing really well personally, which is I guess good news, since a few weeks ago I was talking about the mental health struggles I was experiencing. So I'm glad to report that I'm feeling a lot better. But I think that it is noteworthy that I am also experiencing part of that rage, the collective rage that's going on right now, because I'm also seeing how pervasive racism is, how pervasive the complacency is, even with well-intended white folks. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it seems like everyone forgot the lessons, but I think it's more than that. I think it is just, utter ignorance, and like perpetuating that ignorance through the media, which is something we're going to talk about further today. So yeah, I'm well, but I'm feeling rage and sadness and all of the things that we all feel whenever there's horrible events like mass shootings, which, I mean, there's been 2 of them in the last week.
There's actually been 7 of them in the past week, but 2 of them, yes, I know, but 2 of them have received most of the attention.
Right.
And we're going to dive into this after just JC on YouTube watching us saying, hi, Joe Nice. Hi, Kat. Hi,
hello.
JC. JC is also a native Albertan like yourself.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Canadian. So as usual, we are international. This is what we do out here. We take a global perspective on these issues: humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. And we try to make them, not dumb them down, but we try to make each of these morsels of information more digestible for everybody. I'm going to say that again. We try to make each of these morsels of information more digestible for everybody, because there's some stuff that we say that you might miss the first time around or the second time around. That's why we videotape these episodes. That's why we have them recorded, so you can go back and listen to them at your own leisure. Please. Yeah. Please. Now, as you so eloquently said a few minutes ago, you said today's episode is about race, the media, and white fragility. 8 or 9 months ago, we did an episode on the Joe and Kat Chat series, the best podcast series in the history of podcasts, about Karens and white fragility. And I started that episode with a quote from Dr. David Lee, English professor at the University of Oregon, who was providing an introduction to the esteemed professor, Dr. Cornel West. I'm going to read you this quote from that speech, and then we will get into the conversation, because I want to make sure that we set the tone for what we are getting into today. Now, Dr. David Lee said, race is not a thing, but a relationship. Race is biological irrelevance with fatal social consequences. It is not about symbolic representation and feel-good respect. It is about equality and the exercise of rights and responsibilities and the access to political, economic, and cultural power. It is about the citizenry's ownership of democracy and its deprivatization. Race matters differently for different reasons. Race reinforces over time, through repetition and variation, the boundaries between settlers and natives, masters and slaves, citizens and aliens, and from institutional investment in oneness to the current racial politics of the White House. Today, what we're going to do, Ms. Wells, is we are going to examine race, the media, and white fragility through that lens of everything I just spent the past 45 seconds reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, I don't know where to start, because we've been talking about this for almost a year. We began these in June of 2020.
Correct.
And I think it was a really great suggestion that you made yesterday, that we just, have a conversation today, because it really, that's what we did on the very first episode, and that's what began this whole thing. And it's so blatant that these issues are still so embedded in our society, in our culture, in our psyches, and in everything around us, that like nothing has changed. I
agree. And we are going to have that conversation. What we always do in typical Joe and Kat Chats fashion and style and custom, we like coming up with definitions, because there might be some terminology, there might be some words that you might not understand, or you think you understand them, but then you hear us actually define them, and then it changes the context of your knowledge base. As I've said before, information changes situations, and we're here for each of you, and that's what we're going to do today. So, race. We've talked about this on several occasions. We'll bring up the definition of race again. Race are humans categorized into distinct groups based upon distinct physical characteristics or social qualities. That is what race is.
Yeah.
That is what race is. Kat, you and I are different races because we have distinct and different physical characteristics and different social characteristics. Race.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay? Race.
I mean, race.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say race also carries more weight, representing not just one's, physical features, but ancestry, historical affiliation, and shared culture as well. So.
Absolutely. Now, racism is the belief that different races have different characteristics and abilities and qualities that makes one group superior and another inferior. Typically, when you talk about racism, there is obviously a racial hierarchy, and for generations, decades, centuries, and maybe eons, white people have always thought of themselves as being a superior group than all other racial categorizations. That feeling that white people are more superior than all other races is what we call white supremacy.
Yeah.
Now, there is again, racism is the belief that certain groups of people are better than other groups of people. That is racism. White supremacy is when white people believe that their race is better than all other races.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just white people. White supremacy is also embedded in our culture. And I mean, there are people that are not white that believe in white supremacy because of how pervasive it is. And so, yeah, I think that's something to be noted, that it's not just a personal belief. It's embedded in our cultures, in our interactions, in all of our lives.
I agree. And as we've talked about in the colorism episode of the Joe and Kat Chat series, once again, the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, we've said that there are people who access blackness and uphold white supremacy. We've talked about Kamala Harris. We've talked about the previous president of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama. Both of them are black faces in high places, but their politics, their activities, their rhetoric uphold white supremacy, even though they are identified as black people.
Yes,
so
exactly.
As you so succinctly and accurately said, Ms. Wells, there are plenty of other people who are not white that support white supremacy, either implicitly or explicitly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now, white fragility is that uneasiness that white people have when confronted by racism, I can speak, I promise you, racism and injustice.
Yeah.
And reactions to white fragility include anger, guilt, fear, silence, or violence. Anger, fear, guilt, silence, or violence. Now, there are certain factors that lead to white fragility, and some of these factors are segregation, universalism and individualism, entitlement to racial comfort. We're going to dig into that in a little bit. Racial arrogance, racial belonging, and of course, white dominance.
Sorry, the dog is barking as usual.
Okay, Onus is a big dog. Out to Onus. Onus is a part of this entire podcast also.
Yeah, his barks, usually anyway. Yeah, I mean, white fragility is something that I'm familiar with, both because I've experienced it. I've gone through a process of having, fragile emotions about race. I process those and I'm hopefully over it, but you never know. I can always, this is not a goal, being an anti-racist ally is not a destination, I should say. It's a thing that you have to work on throughout your entire life. And so, yeah, there's a lot of ways that white fragility can come up, and we'll have to talk, or we will talk about that a lot more coming up.
We will. Yeah. Now, where did the term white fragility come from? A lot of people hear this term, but they don't understand where it came from. It came from a professor named Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And back in 2011, she wrote a paper about race and social injustice. Dr. D'Angelo has a PhD in multicultural education. And that paper eventually became a book called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And I urge each and every one of you to read that book. It is an outstanding piece of work. Please read it. And her book explains how white fragility promotes racism. Now, we cannot talk about white fragility and white supremacy without white privilege.
Agreed.
White privilege is the ideology that white people have certain advantages that other people do not. And as I've said before, privilege is a form of blindness. Privilege prevents you from seeing the oppression and struggle that other people have. Privilege, especially white privilege, is the antithesis of intersectionality. Because you can't be intersectional without understanding what somebody else is dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And privilege prevents you from opening your heart, and most importantly, opening your mind to understanding someone else's struggle, so you can see someone else's struggle through their eyes. White privilege, I want to make sure I'm perfectly clear about this as a Black person saying this to a white woman and probably sharing this with a mostly white audience. White privilege is not an attack on all white people, nor is it an attack on the person. It's not an attack on you. So I want to make sure that when we say, yo, look, this is white privilege. We're not talking about you specifically, and we're not talking about all white people, because hasty generalizations truly damage the type of important conversations that need to be had when we're talking about race. We can't attack people personally and then expect to have any sort of meaningful conversation moving forward. So again, white privilege is not an attack on all white people, nor is it an attack on the person personally.
Yeah, thank you very much for saying that, because that's a really important point when we're talking about white privilege. And I think that racism is used as, an identity marker. Sometimes it's used in a way that makes it seem like it is a personal issue and an individualistic issue, when it's not. It's systemic, it's pervasive, and it's in all of us, whether we like it or not, racism. So yeah, instead of getting personally, hurt or using your white fragility, being fragile because of your whiteness, because you've been called out for something, or someone has identified some white privilege in your life, like, that's not a personal attack. I agree. You just need to reflect and address that and just acknowledge it, move forward. And if you need to, Google how to move forward in an anti-racist way, because a lot of the ways that people react can, display white fragility, whether they intend to or not.
Or a lot of the ways that people can react to white fragility end up in those 5 adjectives that I talked about earlier: anger, guilt, fear, violence, and silence. Now, I'm going to dig back to something that we talked about months ago involving accountability partnerships. That was one of the episodes that we did in the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, Joe and Cat Chats. And we had solutions for how to be an accountability partner when dealing with anti-racism. And of course, I take notes, and I wrote those notes down, and I'm going to read you my notes again, just in case anybody forgot what we said 8 months ago. Please. When dealing with anti-racism, in order to be an accountability partner, what we want to do is have open conversations. If you have a meeting or an encounter with somebody, talk about what you are doing to educate yourself and to help yourself. Number 3, hold yourself and the other person accountable for words or statements that are said incorrectly. If you remember from the language episode, I said words have the power to harm, words have the power to heal, words have the power to hurt, words have the power to help.
Yeah.
Number 4, talk about ways to create systemic change instead of boutique activism performative justice, and one of the terms I came up with just off the cuff, woke theatrics.
Yeah.
We can't have reactive change. We must be proactive. And something else that I also said during that episode is that the private work is just as important as the public work.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to fix the inside before you can fix the outside. There's a quote from one of the greatest albums of all time is The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. There's a song that she had on that album called That Thing. And towards the back end of the song, Lauryn Hill sung, "How you gonna win when you ain't right within? Come again. How are you going to win if you're not right within? You have to fix in here first before you can help other people. Fix here, work on yourself. It's holding yourself accountable. What did you read? What did you learn? What did you watch? Were there uncomfortable moments? How did you react to those uncomfortable moments? Did you take a stand against racism when you saw it? How can you do better and grow? How can you stay more engaged? Not making a statement and not speaking out about about racist activities is making a statement about racist activities.
Yes.
And not being active, not making a post, for example, on Instagram or Facebook is in fact making a post. We're at a point right now in the world where we can't sit by and watch situations happen anymore. Those days are over. We either have to, my uncle told me this years ago, God rest his soul. He said, Joe, you either got to call somebody out or call someone in.
I love that.
And I'm going to say that again.
Please.
All right? Because Ansel Adolphus Anderson is one of the smartest people I ever had the privilege of knowing. You either call somebody out or call someone in. Okay? And as I said in the beginning of this episode, each conversation is focused on collaboration and not competition. So you either call somebody out or call somebody in. And when you call somebody in, you have your hands open and your arms open and your mind open and your heart open so you can help them and so they can help you so we all can grow together.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. It's so important to do that inner work. And that I just want to say that does not absolve you from doing things outside of yourself as well, because I think a lot of white fragility is the guilt and the fear of saying the wrong thing, or the guilt of having had experiences where you realize at the time, or you perpetuated racism, etc. It leads to silence, and white silence is just as bad. That's part of white fragility. So yes, the inner work is important. Everyone needs to be self-reflective on all of the things that go on around them. I've had experiences where I walked away from whatever it was, and then I went, oh shit, this is something I should have spoke up about because it was racist. And so I had to learn to, I reflected on that and learned to identify these things in a more timely manner. I had to focus on that in order to speak up when there is injustice. So I just want to be clear that this is not about staying silent when you have fear about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. People make mistakes. We all have shitty conversations where we're wrong, but just be willing to change. Be willing to listen.
That's it. And the more privilege that people have, the more blind they become to other people's oppression.
Yeah.
And as you so eloquently said earlier on today, these conversations are not easy. They take up a lot of energy. And there's another concept I want to discuss before we actually talk about the stuff that's happened around the world. Terminology is called racial stamina. Racial stamina. And that is the ability to have meaningful, difficult, and civil conversations about race over an extended period of time.
Mm.
And as I've said before in this podcast series, again, the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, I said these conversations are also focused around love, and love sometimes means that you have to have difficult conversations. Love comes in the form of having difficult conversations.
Yeah.
But out of those difficult conversations, there will have to be some sort of meaning and some sort of value that you can take from it. Now, why is having these conversations so difficult? Because conversations about race have three requirements: energy, emotions, and the one commodity that we always lose: time. Energy, emotions, and time. And given the way our society is constructed right now, especially with the pandemic that we all have been dealing with for the better part of a little more than a year now, our society is short on all three of those commodities: energy, emotions, and time.
Yeah.
I think it was either Sir Isaac Newton or Thomas Edison that said, no new energy is created. Energy is neither gained nor lost.
Mm.
So the energy that you have, it is what it is. So with that energy that you have in your body, you have to manage that the best way you can, which is why self-care is so important, because you only have so much energy to spend. You only have so much energy to give. Time is a commodity. The Steve Miller Band once said, time keeps on slipping into the future. Culture Club lead singer Boy George once said, time, it used to be so much more, and time is precious, I know. And he said, time won't give me time, but time makes lovers feel like they've got something real. But you and me, we know we've got nothing but time, but time won't give me time. Emotions. Go ahead and turn on Earth, Wind, and Fire and listen to that song, Devotion. And it talks about the emotions. We are short on all three.
Yeah.
But if you invest yourself, the emotions, the time, and energy necessary to deal with anti-racism, the investment is not only going to benefit your life, but could potentially save somebody else's life. And every life on this earth is precious. No one deserves to die at the hands of a white supremacist. No one deserves to die, period, simply on the basis of the color of their skin or political affiliation or membership of a social group or religion or for anything.
Yeah.
Invest in this work, because investing in this work will ensure that my daughter, and if you decide to have kids, your kids, and if my daughter has kids, that they can eventually live to see what Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about in 1962 when he gave that speech at the Lincoln Memorial, where he talked about being judged on not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. Thank you for all of that. I think it's so true. I think that, I mean, time is ticking and our emotions are high right now because of, all of the stuff that's going on in the world. And I think that the exchange of energy that we can have in these times is so important, whether it's, using love to have conversations about really difficult subjects like race, racism, white privilege, white supremacy, all of the things that are surrounding the events that are going on in the world. I think that it's so important to continue these conversations. And I think that's why both of us are so committed to this. We've been talking about these issues for months, and we're not going to stop, because for me, it's so important to continue to have these conversations as often as possible, because that is how you impact other people. And I think the way that we approach it through love is the best way. Others might disagree, but yeah, it's so necessary because of how blatant the just systemic racism is in all of our society and all of our cultures. Everything that's going on is a display of how disgusting it is.
About 4 weeks ago, we did an episode for Black History Month about Black men in music. And one of the men that we spoke about is the great Stevie Wonder. And we talked about his magnum opus album from 1976 called Songs in the Key of Life. And one of the songs on that album is a song called Love's in Need of Love Today. Love's in Need of Love Today. And I vividly remember reading the lyrics to that song. But I'm not going to do it again because we have about 30 minutes left in today's episode. But I just want to make sure everybody understands that now more than ever, love is in need of love today. Don't delay, send yours in right away. That's what Stevie Wonder sung about. And something else I want to make sure we define before we actually dig into our conversation today, Ms. Wells, is the definition of media. Media.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, media is one of these Latin words that has a strange word ending. Media is actually plural. You can't have a singular version of media. The singular version of the word media is the word medium. Now, media is the collection of mass communication. Now, that could happen with broadcasting, that could happen with publishing, that could happen through what is now known as the fourth and fifth estates, the fourth estate being the internet and the fifth estate being blogs and social media. You could when we talk about broadcasting could have various forms. You could have a podcast like you and I are doing right now. You could have internet radio. You can have satellite radio. You can have radio on the FM and AM dials, which is what is known as terrestrial radio. You can have publishing, whether in journals, magazines, newspapers, journals, etc. So media. And media, I want to make sure that people understand, is the media in the United States is no longer what it used to be. There has been an assault on especially the print media, and the one person we can thank for that is none other than William Jefferson Clinton, otherwise known as Bill Clinton. Take a look at the Telecommunications Act, I think of 1996, which took 50 news organizations and consolidated them into 6. And of those 6 news organizations, all of them are corporate controlled. Over 90% of the media that we consume, whether it is print, whether it is spoken word, whatever it is, 90% is owned by one of these 6 media conglomerates. And the mainstream, again, they're all corporate owned. There is an agenda behind each of these media outlets and organisms and organizations, I should say. And quite honestly, I said organisms, but that's really not terribly inaccurate, because the mainstream media, it's not just an organism, it's a virus. And it slowly affects each of us on a day-to-day basis the more we consume it. And the less opportunities that we have to consume independent media that is not corporate controlled and influenced by the dollar or any sort of adverse ideology, and the censorship of journalists. And we've talked about that in the Whistleblowers episode. We talked about Julian Assange. We talked about Jamal Khashoggi. We talked about Edward Snowden. We didn't get a chance to talk about Daniel Ellsberg. We should have. I think we did speak about him. the attack on mainstream media and the narratives that uphold white supremacy is what we're going to spend the next 24 minutes and 55 seconds discussing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think something that is on my mind and has been for, a week plus is the Atlanta shooting and how that was broadcast by media. The shooting, if anyone is unfamiliar with it, happened in Atlanta, where a 21-year-old white man shot 8 people, 7 of which were women, 6 of which were women of Asian descent. This murderer faces charges of malice murder and aggravated assault. So they took this person into custody after a car chase. The Cherokee County Sheriff's Office captain, Jay Baker, who told the media in a press conference that a sexual addiction may have fueled the crime, and said that Long had, quote, a really bad day, end quote. Now, this is just another example of how cops are perpetuating these stereotypes. This is a mass murderer. It was clearly racially motivated. He directly targeted 3 different massage parlors that were not actually close together. He had to drive between them. So it's not a bad day. This is a police captain should be he should be resigning or be fired right away for even making these comments. And those comments also perpetuate Asian stereotypes and sex workers as being disposable people in our society by excusing this horrible white man with this ridiculous excuse. He had a bad day and he might be have a sexual addiction. That's bullshit. I don't know if you want to comment, Joe, but we could talk about this probably for the rest of the episode.
I do. Last week, NBC News told Black people how they can be better allies to Asian people after Robert Aaron Long, he's the 21-year-old man from Atlanta, murdered 6 Asian women in Atlanta due to, again, as you said earlier, his uncontrollable sexual addiction. Now, instead of Robert Long addressing his sexual addiction, he chose to kill the perceived causes of addiction, which were 7 women, 6 of them of Asian descent. Now, when Robert Long killed these 6 Asian women, the root cause of that, it's white fragility. And you're probably like, well, Joe, wait a minute, is it racism? It's white fragility. Because you remember what I said earlier. White fragility manifests itself in anger, fear, silence, or violence. Mm-hmm. So because he was unable to control his sexual desires and urges, the worst manifestation of violence is taking somebody else's life. And that's what he did. And white fragility also has its roots in control. It's white people being able to control the emotions of BIPOC people. It's being able to tone police when they see fit.
Yes.
It is easier to control. Let me rephrase this. It's easier to kill what you can't control instead of addressing the pathologies that created the white fragility issues that Robert Long experienced in the first place. I'm going to make sure I say that again in case anybody missed it. It's easier to kill what you cannot control instead of addressing the pathologies that caused you to have white fragility issues in the first place. And it's this sort of same white fragility that, quite frankly, white police officers have when they encounter Black people. Because again, it's easier to kill what you cannot control instead of dealing with the pathologies that created white fragility in the first place. And we've seen numerous examples of this. We saw this with George Floyd. We saw it with Breonna Taylor. Remember Eric Garner, everybody? We saw this with Jonathan Price, Walter Wallace Jr., Ahmaud Arbery, Rashard Brooks, Daniel Prude, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Corin Gaines, Freddie Gray from my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland, Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, who was shot 3 times in the chest with his fiance in the passenger seat and his child in the back seat, Alton Sterling, and Trayvon Martin, just to name a few of these people, of these Black people that were the perceived cause of white police officers' white fragility.
Yes.
And it's this sort of mutation of white fragility that, quite honestly, causes some white people to stand specifically for Asian lives, but not necessarily standing for Black lives.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I absolutely will. I absolutely will. Because now more than ever, we're in a time when it's easy for white people to participate in boutique activism. It's easy for quite honestly white people to do all sorts of mental gymnastics to justify their white fragility. It's easy for it's easy for people to look the other way or support a different group of people when it fits who they want to support or who they want to identify with. But when it's not somebody that you want to support or want to identify with, it's easy to look away and say, you know what? Yeah, it's okay, whatever. I don't necessarily care about Black people being shot in the street by white police officers, but I do care about these 6 Asian women. My point in all of this, Kat, is this. Nobody gets the opportunity to pick and choose which group of oppressed people they feel like supporting on a given day or whatever side of the bed they wake up on. We're at a point now where we stand with all marginalized people or we don't stand with any of them.
Yes.
That's the point I want to make sure we illustrate today. That's the point by what I said a couple of minutes ago. We don't get to pick and choose who we feel like standing with. We don't get to pick and choose who we feel like supporting. So whether it's First Nations people in Canada or the Indigenous in the United States, whether it's the Rohingya in Myanmar, whether it's the Uyghurs in China, whether it's Asian women in Atlanta, we have to stand and support and stand with all marginalized people, regardless of who they are, regardless of where they are.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that is absolutely what this entire Joe and Kat Chat series has been about. We educate people about stuff that's going on because we care about all of the marginalization, because there are people that have power and maintain power, and it's just created this horrendous culture and society where those with power maintain and get more and more and more power and control over, like, on the backs of marginalized people. And I mean, it sounds to me like you were talking about the whole model minority trope, which is absolutely a thing that white folks are sort of being performative about with their activism, because the mono-minority trope, if you care about Asian women and you don't care about Black folks getting shot, that's directly linked to white supremacy, because the model minority is a false thing that the media has created to make you think that Asian folks are better, or better at being minorities than Black people or Indigenous people. And what that does is perpetuate stereotypes about Black people or Indigenous people or whatever other group. You can use anybody as an example, because another thing that you just mentioned a few minutes ago, Joe, is that white police officers murder Black people, and usually it's because they say they were feared for their life, so they had to use their gun.
Well said.
And as you said before, like, this is directly linked to white fragility. Fear is one of the descriptors that you used.
And the other is violence.
Pardon?
And the other is violence.
Fear and violence. Yeah, absolutely.
The other is violence.
And guilt. And, it's silence, anger, guilt, fear, violence. Like, these are all things that manifest in different ways. But when you really look at things from an outsider's perspective, you can totally link all of this garbage, like this horrendous stuff, back to white fragility and white supremacy ultimately.
Yes. And, the days of supporting a group of people for your own political or personal preference is over. And now more than ever, and this is something that I've talked about here and other places, we need to resist. We need to resist those who are in power. And we need to stand with those who have been oppressed, and we need to learn from those who have been oppressed, because those who have been oppressed know how to resist and fight back. Because one of the pathologies of oppression is being able to fight against those who oppress you.
Mm.
And you don't have to be smart to resist. You don't have to be smart to resist. Or you don't have to have 2 master's degrees like me or 1 like you. You don't have to be smart. What you have to be is courageous. Take a look at some of the people that we've profiled in the Black History Month series. Harriet Tubman was not taught how to read. Okay? She wasn't book smart, but 4 or 5 colleges went through that woman. And she had courage from here to the moon and back.
Yeah.
It's that sort of courage that we need. Rosa Parks didn't have a PhD. She didn't have 2 doctorate degrees and published in all sorts of journals. She just said, you know what? I'm not getting out of my seat for you. And it's that sort of courage that's rooted in resistance that we need now more than ever. The white supremacy and white fragility, it's also rooted in white privilege. And white privilege is when you have a 17-year-old kid in Kenosha, Wisconsin named Kyle Rittenhouse walking down the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin with an AR-15 rifle. He shoots and kills 2 people. The police watched him do it. Conversely, Jacob Blake in the same town of Kenosha, Wisconsin, was shot 7 times in the back while walking away from a police officer. And the justification for shooting Jacob Blake 7 times in the back was because he had a knife in his car, not on him, in his car. And he was shot 7 times in the back, which means Jacob Blake was walking away from the police officer and the police officer shot him 7 times. To make matters worse, Jacob Blake has use of one of his 4 limbs, and the police officers handcuffed him to the bed in the hospital. This white privilege happens when George Zimmerman says that he fears for his life by a 12-year-old black child named Trayvon Martin. Because of some bullshit stand your ground laws, George Zimmerman kills Trayvon Martin, and George Zimmerman is allowed to walk the streets. Additionally, George Zimmerman is now autographing packs of Skittles and profiting from killing Trayvon Martin, because Trayvon Martin had a pack of Skittles in his pocket when the incident took place years ago. That is what white privilege looks like. White privilege is Dylan Roof, 25 or 26-year-old white guy, walks into a Charleston, South Carolina church and shoots 9 people and kills 9 people and injures a 10th. And the cops take him alive. And he's been convicted of, I think, 9 counts of murder and all sorts of weapons charges, and he's eventually going to die in jail. That is what white privilege looks like. And white privilege has also manifested itself when a white woman named Ashley Barrett storms the Capitol building on January 6th, and all of these suburban wine moms and driving range dads across America were saying, wait a minute, how could Ashley Barrett get shot in the face? How could this happen? How could this happen? But no one had anything to say when Botham Jean, a black man sitting in his house, was shot by a white cop. No one had anything to say. Those suburban wine moms and driving range dads had nothing to say when Atiana Jefferson was playing video games and was shot by cops. No one had anything to say. No one had anything to say when around this time last year, black people who were living in China were being persecuted and harassed by Chinese people. And if you want to know how I know about that, it's because I have some friends of mine who are black who live in China who had this happen to them. And they told me about this. And they told me, and they showed me videos of black people being harassed by Chinese people because Chinese people in China thought they were the people who created the coronavirus and brought it over. And no one said anything about those black people being persecuted in China. No one said anything. No one said anything. I'm bringing that example up to reinforce and reiterate what I said earlier. The days of supporting who the hell you feel like supporting for political gain and for personal satisfaction and comfort are fucking over. It's fucking over. You stand with everybody or get the fuck out of the way.
Yeah.
Stay home. Stay home.
And I mean, to go further in that example, I mean, it's disgusting that that's happening. And it's disgusting that here in North America, the anti-Asian violence and incidents of hate crimes have risen, depending on what city, but in the country of America, they've risen by 149% since this time last year. So in 16 major cities, there was a report done by the Center for Study of Hate and Extremism. And so this is 149% anti-Asian hate crimes have risen since in 2020 compared to 2019. And there's also a report that came out that from the Chinese Canadian National Council or the Toronto chapter here in Canada. They released a report compiling the results of 2 surveys that tallied 1,150 occurrences of racism against Asian Canadians since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic between March 10th, 2020 and February 28th, 21. So the types of racism reported in these reports, 44% of cases were reported in British Columbia, the province I currently reside in, and 40% were reported in Ontario, the province I just moved away from. This is disgusting. 60% of victims identified as women. 11% of cases included violent physical assault or unwanted contact. There are two websites I want to mention before we wrap up. To report anti-Asian racism incidences, you can go to covidracism.ca or eliminatehate.org, and it's elimin the number 8 and then hate.org. And one last thing I want to mention when we're talking about this stuff is there is a slogan going around. I've seen it a bunch of times on my Instagram. It's racism is a virus. And so I just want to note that this slogan is super catchy and useful in the sense that it, catches the attention and puts attention on this issue because it is a real issue. But it is also ableist. Ableism means the discrimination or social prejudice against people with disabilities based on their belief that typical abilities are superior. So the reason why this is ableist is because the connotation is that racism is caught or spread instead of learned. And so it also doesn't acknowledge the pervasive and systemic basis or root of racism itself. So
I just thank you for saying that.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure that, and again, we got about 3.5 minutes left. And I mentioned my Uncle Ansel, and he said, you either call somebody out or call somebody in.
Yeah.
Okay? Fuck it. I'm calling people out.
Good.
Where's the All Lives Matters? Where's the All Lives Matter crew? Where the fuck are you? Where are they? If all lives matter, again, because that's what we heard last summer. Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Well, no, that's not fair. All lives matter because my life matters too. Okay. Where's the All Lives Matter crew now? Where are you? Where are you? I don't hear anything from you. I don't see anything from you. Where are all the white people that messaged me that I haven't spoken to in 15 or 20 or in some cases 30 years speaking out about racism? Where the fuck are you? None of them around. Nowhere to be seen. Nowhere to be heard.
Yeah.
It is not my responsibility to help you deal with your white fragility and your white people problems. It is not my fucking problem. It is not my obligation to help you. Mm-hmm. Work on that shit your fucking self.
Yeah.
Work on it yourself. And now more than ever, if all lives matter, again, because this is what we heard from every driving range dad and every suburban wine mom. That's what we heard. All lives matter, Joe. All lives matter, Joe. Come on, Joe. All lives matter. All lives matter. Okay? And if all lives matter, then Black lives matter. Then Indigenous people lives matter. Then the lives of every LGBTQIA plus person matters. And Asian lives matter. And our Jewish brothers and sisters, their lives matter. And the precious brothers and sisters in Palestine, you know what? Their fucking lives matter too. Okay? So all lives matter. Be about it. Don't talk about it. Be about it. All lives, if all lives truly matter, and those Asian women's lives matter, then the 10 people who were murdered in Boulder, Colorado yesterday at that grocery store, their lives matter too.
Yeah.
You know what, Kat? As a member of the queer community, as you said earlier, your life matters. Mm-hmm. I'm black, and I'm black all day long. My life matters too.
Yeah.
We got to wrap things up. You're welcome. We got to wrap things up.
I just want to say thank you for your rage, because I think some people would find it uncomfortable. And I think that is not an appropriate response, because that rage is what fuels us. It needs to be there so that we can change it. We need justice. We've been saying it for years. We're still saying it now. We need justice.
We need justice.
For all of the folks that you mentioned in this whole episode.
Everybody. And I don't want to hear anybody come up to me and saying, Joe, you're racist for talking about this. Or,
No.
Can't we all just get along? That is the quintessential response for somebody that is dealing with white fragility.
Yes, absolutely.
Kat, we got to go.
We do. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Peace.